Thank you, everyone, and thanks to Sam for curating this fantastic panel that we're going to have a lot of pleasure listening to this afternoon. I'm not going to take much time here because we really want to hear from our speakers. So let me announce the presence of Jehanne Rousseau, who is a studio director at Spiders Games. She's a director and co-founder, and who's also a producer and a scriptwriter of a number of games. And she's going to be talking about her creative approach. So really, I'd like a lot of applause for Jehanne Rousseau. Thank you so much. I'm going to try and get my presentation working. So my name is Jehanne Rousseau. I started working in video games in late '98, but officially in 1999, almost 10 years ago now, in a very small company called RFX Interactive. And as you can see, I did fantastic games on Game Boy, and then Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advanced. It was kind of the prehistory of video games. And the experience was really interesting because with very short development stages, we had really limited means. The size of the games was really limited by the cartridge sizes, so access to a very limited number of colors. So it was a really arduous experience. Technically speaking, we had small teams that did everything. I did 2D graphics, animation, participating in the game and leveling design. And at the same time, we had the programmer who did the music. Everybody did a little bit of everything, really a Swiss Army knife. But I learned a lot. I think we all did. But it was quite frustrating also sometimes because we were so limited. And the cinematographic element was pretty much null. But then I went to Gameloft. It was really at the very beginning, the start of the company. Gameloft had just changed names. 1 week previously, they came from WAP. And the first games I worked on were on old Nokia phones. Maybe you remember those? With these super simple games, even more simple than what we did on the Game Boys. Also very limited content. Few possibilities for image and animation. But in fact, in about 1.5 years, we went for these old Nokia phones to the Engage, which was a complete commercial failure, but technically was so much more evolved. And I developed the Spring to Sell, which made things more attractive, made possible things that more attractive and more evolving as gameplay, as far as gameplay goes. So that really major learning experiences, but also lots of limitations. We were working on things that belonged to Ubisoft, and they played this censorship role about what we developed with teams that were dispatched around the world. So it wasn't always easy with regard to communication. So once again, I learned a lot, but once again, lots of frustration. So that after that experience, I stopped for about 2 years working in video games, and I played in role-play games. I worked for Backstab, which is a French magazine of role-play games. I wrote stories, did illustrations, really lots of different things, but the problem was that you can't make a living doing that. So at one point, I had to go back to work for some money, and I got lucky to get a job with Monte Cristo and to work on a fantastic project which is called Silverfall, and then Earth Awakening, which came after it. So I joined that company, and we had really carte blanche to, as a team, to create a role-playing game, a kind of hack and slash game in a universe that we had to create from nothing. And we had a lot of latitude. We had a few creative constraints. kind of bizarre constraints. Our studio director really wanted there to be elves in the game. I don't know why, but we had to have elves. But as for the rest, we had a lot of freedom, pretty much entirely freedom. And we had an original idea that we had a fantasy universe, but with lots of steampunk elements. We used a lot of comic artists creating environments and creatures, and we were able to really let ourselves go and create a crazy atmosphere. It was a great experience. And with that team I worked on Silverfall, once we'd finished, we didn't really want to split up. Monte Cristo was going to change projects and worked on massive multiplayer stuff, and so there were projects that didn't have space for us, and so we left Monte Cristo and we founded Spiders 10 years ago now. So to start, we had this role-player game. It's really the kind of game we like as a team. And we had some ideas, started developing them, and at the time we were a completely unknown company. And it was an economic period in video gaming that was pretty difficult. We had a hard time getting funding to create big projects. So we went around in circles for about a year and a half without being able to sell it. We'd made a lot of progress on the universe, but we didn't find a publisher or any funders. So one day, coming back from a meeting with Sony in the UK, we were pretty depressed, basically, and we got the idea of creating a completely different kind of game. It was a role-player game, but targeted to children, something much more accessible to the general audience, based on fairy tales. And we created a new universe, saying that we're going to do a little game, and it'll be available only on downloading platforms, and therefore we could work on a small budget. And with that project, we were able to get some attention from Focus Interactive, who published us, and they released the game. I should have a video here. Insert video. It's okay, I can live without it, but you know. There we go. It's dated, please be a bit indulgent with me.
Once upon a time, in a land far away from our world, the kingdom of Avalon, a world of strange and enchanted lands filled with magical creatures. A king, witnessing his lands threatened and his people fading away, called for a hero able to save Avalon from its tragic fate. Become this hero. Get ready to discover a fantastical world. Spread your wings to save Avalon and face the most fierce dangers.
Donc, je peux vous le mettre en entier parce que c'est un peu long.
I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but what was unique about that game was that you could play with a tiny little 15-centimeter creature that you could slip into every one of the spaces. We decided to use 3D. It seems pretty obvious, but there were very few games that used the ability to move up and down as well. So we had worlds that were spheres, and inside of those spheres the game was completely, the player was free to move in 3 dimensions, to fly and to slip into cracks, as you can see in the pirate ship. It caused us some kind of conceptual problems when we were designing the set, the environment, but it gave a pretty unique gameplay. It was a game that worked pretty well.
au tout petit budget qu'on avait
in relationship to the
dedans.
tiny budget we
On avait
invested.
travaillé au niveau graphique avec Jean-Baptiste Monge, qui
We
est un
worked with Jean-Baptiste Monge for the
assez
graphics.
spécialisé dans
He was an
justement la
illustrator
représentation de la féerie, qui a
specialized
fait beaucoup de livres
in
d'illustration sur le
fairy
sujet,
environments.
mais qui, suite à ce projet,
But
a
after
continué à
this
travailler dans le jeu vidéo.
project,
Et
went on to
notamment
work in video games,
pour
specifically
Blizzard.
for
Il
Blizzard.
a travaillé sur les derniers projets de Blizzard.
He worked on their most recent projects.
Ensuite, on a travaillé sur un
Then we
projet qui
worked
s'appelle Of
on
Orcs and Men. C'était un projet
Men. It was
pour le coup, sur lequel on travaillait un petit peu en
a
mercenaire.
project we worked on as
pour les
mercenaries in a
développeurs
way.
Ils avaient en fait une idée d'univers et
The commissioner had an
de
idea of a
scénario,
universe and
mais
a
ils ne
story,
pouvaient pas développer ce
but they
jeu-là en
couldn't
interne à ce
develop it
moment-là,
internally at the
parce
time.
qu'ils avaient eux-mêmes déjà toutes leurs
Because they
équipes
themselves
à fond
had
sur à
their
l'époque
teams
le RPG du Trône de Fer.
completely
Donc,
into the
du coup, ils ont effectivement
Game of
demandé de
Thrones
développer ce
RPG.
projet.
So
C'était
they
pour
asked
nous un
us to
très gros
develop the
budget par
program. It
rapport à
was
ce
a
qu'on avait pu
huge
faire
budget compared to
auparavant.
what we'd done
Et
previously.
ça a été une expérience
And it was
assez unique,
a really
dans le
unique
sens où le
experience
directeur créatif était extérieur à l'équipe,
in
puisqu'il
that
était
the
donc de
creative
chez
director
Cyanide.
was with Cyanide.
Il était... Est-ce que je vais réussir à lancer ce truc? Je suis pas très douée, hein.
Technical problems, it's surprising, huh?
Dying of loneliness. The Bloodjaws are a family. My family. Doesn't it bother you watching your brethren getting slaughtered?
No, I'm not like them.
It's time to put an end to the genocide that's been ravaging our people for decades. An end to this campaign of hate waged against us.
This war has gone on too long, and our enemy is more powerful than ever. But Mother Earth has not abandoned us. We have allies.
Kels is the last one of those. She is fleeing and cannot come back. She doesn't want to. Not after what she's experienced. Every hour, every minute, her spirit is farther away.
The Inquisition tramples our beliefs and denies our existence. They want to wipe my people off the face of the world.
Today, we are setting off to kill the Emperor.
You'll be facing experience and cold-hearted warriors, a far greater test than the Empire or Inquisition today.
On part ailleurs, je coupe parce que, comme tous les trailers de lancement, c'est un peu long.
It's a long launch trailer, of course, but you can see that it's a completely different genre from what we had just developed previously, because it's not a fairy and a sweet little creature. So we did this really major creative work. The universe had started to be kind of becoming more solid, but we had to do a lot of concept art to develop environments and also costumes and all of the rest of that for all of the game characters, and framed by a creative director who wasn't on site. So it was kind of complicated, to tell you the truth, but it was a great experience, and it was our first big budget game as Spiders. As you can see, there was a kind of an initial staging that was pretty exciting. We worked with Olivier de Rivière, who's a musician who specializes in video games and who's now quite well known and has won a number of awards. If I have a little bit of time at the end, I'll show a video that he did about his work. And then we were finally able to get back to a universe that we'd created, the one on Mars, and to sell the project and get interest from Focus, which at the time was a bit hesitant. This kind of post-apocalyptic landscapes would work in RPG games, and they weren't really sure, they weren't ready to take that risk, so we had to reduce the scope. I wrote a specific story, a small format, about 15 hours of play, which for an RPG is pretty short, but still it was sold pretty cheaply as well, and it only came out as a download. So it was another type of project again. As you can see, we're remaining in the mature audiences.
Ah, c'est intéressant.
Well, well, well. The handsome boy is back. And with a cute little boy, too.
You are now in Camp 19. If you watch your step, we will get along just fine.
We fight against the corrupt Aurora government. A government that doesn't hesitate to kill the people it just won the war with. A government that oppresses the people and leaves all the decisions in the hands of the technomancers. You've seen the poverty, all the checkpoints, how cruel they are.
Attention! To the dust rebel who hit a guard! If you don't give yourself up in 2 hours, we will shoot 10 of your brothers!
They're doing terrible things. They use us for tests, expose us to the sun. Some of us have even been operated on. If we stay here, we'll die. Or worse.
We're fighting to change all that. To restore freedom and pride to the people of Aurora. With your help, we can do it.
Je précise que je suis pas responsable des inclusions dégueulasses dans le teaser.
Sorry, I'd have to say that I'm not responsible for those horrible inclusions.
Donc, c'était effectivement encore un autre type d'univers.
So once again,
Pour
a
information,
different type of
les
universe.
trailers que
And
vous
for information, these kind of trailers
tournés dans le
are
moteur de
all
jeu.
shot in
Donc
the
c'est
game
vraiment des images
engine.
du jeu, il n'y a pas de
So they're really the
CGI.
images of the games. There's no
Et
CGI.
bon, par contre, après, effectivement,
But
notre
of course,
éditeur rajoute
afterwards,
au
our
moment du
editor
montage
adds during the
des
editing
titres et ce genre de
the
choses. Et
titles
à
and
l'époque,
so
c'était
on.
la mode de rajouter des trucs en 3D
At the
dans
time,
le
it was
teaser.
kind of the style to add 3D elements
Forcément
to
ce que
the
j'estime être
teasers.
voilà, mais bon.
It's not super
C'était,
necessary, but
enfin, nous, en
anyway.
tout cas, c'était pour nous un
For
moment
us, it
assez
was
incroyable de travailler sur ce projet-là.
it was really
Parce
amazing
que
to work
c'était
on that
vraiment, enfin,
project
c'est un univers qui
because
nous tient beaucoup à cœur,
because we really liked
qu'on
that
a fait déjà
universe
pas mal développé
that we had
au
developed
début de
previously
la création de la société,
at the
mais
start
là,
of the
sur lequel on a vraiment
company,
pu
but
aboutir,
there we
montrer
were
quelque
really able
chose,
to bring it to fruition and
ça nous a
produce
permis par la
something,
suite de convaincre
and
notre
that gave
éditeur
us
que
the
finalement
opportunity
la
to convince
SF
our
c'était quelque chose qui
publisher
était,
that
en dehors de Star Wars pouvait quand même se vendre. Et ça a été
this kind of
pour nous
futuristic
un pas en
thing
avant assez
outside of
important.
Star Wars was really
Ensuite, on a travaillé
possible.
sur Born by Flame, qui est
And then
donc
we
on
did
revenait
Born by Flame.
à la fantasy. En
And we're
fait,
in a fantasy world
Focus,
here.
notre éditeur,
Our
nous l'a
publisher
commandé
Focus
quasiment au même moment que
ordered it
quand on a fini Mars.
when we
Alors bien
finished
sûr, comme Mars,
Mars,
c'est un petit projet, on l'a fini plus vite.
because Mars was a
Et,
small
et
project.
Bound
We
by
finished
Flame,
it
qui
pretty
était un beaucoup
quickly,
plus
but
gros
Bound by
budget
Flame,
et,
a
on
much
va
bigger
dire, beaucoup plus
budget,
traditionnel,
a
entre
much more
guillemets, en termes
traditional, quote unquote,
d'univers,
in terms
même
of the
si on a
universe,
voulu quand
even
même
if
le
we
rendre
did want
relativement
to
unique
make it
en prenant le
unique
parti de
by
faire un univers vraiment
taking the approach of doing
la fin du monde est quasiment arrivée, et donc
the end of the world
il y a
is
plus
almost
grand
here
chose à
kind of
faire pour
universe.
espérer
There's
sauver le
really
monde, donc c'est
almost
évidemment
no hope to
relativement
save the world, so it's really quite
et
dark.
on jouait un personnage qui était
And you
possédé
play
par
a
un démon,
character who's possessed by a
qui
demon,
lui pouvait lui accorder un
which
certain nombre de
gave
capacités,
him some
mais qui
powers,
aussi
but
avait un certain nombre
also
de... Non
still no. There's a thing happening here.
This war is lost. Thou wouldst better find the deepest pit and cower there until all is over.
How can you expect us to follow you against the Deadwalkers and their generals, huh?
I always knew it would be you.
There is not enough space inside you for 2 souls. That demon wants your body. It will control you more and more until it has replaced you completely.
I have traveled this world and lived amongst its peoples, its elves, its humans, and I have witnessed the truth of their ilk. Today I fall, but dozens of new brothers and sisters will rise from the dead.
Listen to me. We have no chance against the Deadwalker army, no matter what powers you have.
I am the only one with the power to get us through. Why dost thou resist?
Donc là encore, c'est un projet sur lequel on a travaillé avec Olivier de Rivière.
We worked on it with Olivier de Rivière, and once again created a completely new uniform, costumes, characters, environments.
Et on en parlera sans doute tous ensemble tout à l'heure.
And we can talk about this all together later on, but creating a universe for a role-playing game really requires you to develop a complete universe. You can't just do a set, but you have to go really far in the imagining of the characters and the environments, really think about the political, economic, historic context that underlie that universe, so that the worlds remain believable and coherent throughout the game, which isn't really the same exercise that you have in film. So then we came back to Mars because we convinced our publisher that that universe really could work. So we had Technomancer that takes place in the same universe as our first Mars game. It has different characters, and you meet the same characters. The stories overlay each other, and that allowed us to develop really to the extent that we'd always wanted to. We could develop that universe. So that was a really great experience.
Peggy 16.
Once you become a technomancer, there's no going back. From the moment our abilities are brought into the light to the moment the light is snuffed from our eyes, the technomancers are nothing but pawns on a chessboard.
I chose to side with the humans at a great cost, only to be betrayed by my own brothers.
You think we're fighting for Aurora? You're wrong, officer. The opposition is made of patriots.
Colonel Victor won't stop until he pushes the people of Abundance to flee or fight. Find a way to contact Earth.
Voilà. Donc, et comme vous voyez, la
so as you can see, techniques are evolving with time. We're going from PS3 to PS4 and the Xbox One and PC. We're using our own engine to develop our games, which is something that's evolved with time. We've developed tools that allow us to have cinematics in the game, and we can do the staging, and we have this whole kind of tree of issue. We don't have linear gameplays. We really want the players to make choices that will influence what happens in the story. So to make those things possible to develop, you have to have really kind of cutting-edge tools that we developed for our projects. And the project that we're working on now, Greenfall, will be launching early next year. We created a completely original universe. It's 17th century fantasy. We wanted to create something quite out of the ordinary that takes inspiration from history, but it's not a historic story. There's magic and monsters and that kind of thing. But despite all that, it...
Peggy 16.
J'arrive.
This world is slowing down. How can I fight it? How can I listen when there's no sound? Oh, the wolves are out. Yes, the wolves are out.
Et voilà.
And there you have it.
Donc, 10 ans de...
10 years of development.
Pardon, c'est moi, pardon. Pendant qu'on fait la transition d'ordinateur, j'en profite aussi pour dire que Jehanne Rousseau a déjà fait l'honneur au NIFFF l'année passée d'être membre du jury, ce qui a été aussi une grande chance, et d'avoir revenir aussi cette année, cette fois pour présenter son travail, montrer aussi où on est Spider's Games, et une chance de la voir aussi parmi les amis du NIFFF et de la revoir à Neuchâtel.
Oui, quand on vient à Neuchâtel, on y revient après.
On y revient, voilà.
Once you've come to Neuchâtel, you just keep coming back.
Let me also remind you, if anybody is more attuned to English, that we have upfront translation devices that you can use, and that might be also very useful for our next speech by David Wise, if you prefer, si vous préférez aussi avoir la traduction française. N'hésitez pas à l'entrée à vous servir de matériel de traduction. J'en profite aussi pendant l'installation pour remercier l'équipe de traduction et puis l'équipe technique.
I'd like to thank our translators and also our technical crew who are here with us. Thank you so much.
Alors notre deuxième intervenant dans ce fil rouge qui traite des liens entre jeux vidéo et cinéma est lui aussi particulièrement intéressant à avoir ici, Raoul Barbet, puisqu'il a un parcours dont il va nous parler. Je ne vais pas aller plus que ça dans le détail, lui-même va en parler, mais il a un parcours aussi de directeur de cinématique sur des jeux comme Heavy Rain. Il travaille sur des trailers à Capsule Studio notamment, et puis on l'a vu comme layout artist sur aussi des films en animation 3D, notamment le Lorax. Et puis, plus en avant dans sa carrière, on l'a retrouvé à la gestion de certains festivals justement de cinéma. Donc c'est quelqu'un qui, sans aucun problème, justement, hybride ces deux univers et montre comment, au contraire, on a réellement des passations de savoir-faire. Mais je vais arrêter de parler puisqu'apparemment il est prêt. Merci beaucoup Raoul d'être venu.
Thank you so much to Raoul for coming.
Merci infiniment.
And
merci David.
We're grateful to have you.
Merci beaucoup David, merci à tous
d'être
là.
David, and
merci
thank you to all of you who are here, and of course the NIFFF for inviting us.
Pour cette table ronde, je vais essayer de parler rapidement de mon
parcours to speak briefly about my background and really make connections between video games and cinema, which is our subject. So me, I'm Raoul Barbet. I'm an animated film and video game producer, director.
Voilà, mais je ne sais pas bien parler dans le micro. Je suis ingénieur de formation et j'ai beaucoup travaillé donc, dans les festivals de films, comme disait David, les premières années.
I worked in film festivals
for
a long time. I've worked in Fantastic Films. I'm really happy to be here. I've been in Montreal, Fantasy Film in Montreal, and I've worked in production in documentaries and film, also in Cambodia for an audiovisual center as a technical director. I played Fahrenheit in Cambodia, and I loved that game. And I really just wanted to participate in the adventure of video games. So I joined the stables of Quantic Dreams to work on Yverine.
Pendant 2 ans, donc
Heavy Rain. Worked on Heavy Rain on the motion capture and then the game design. For those of you who don't know Heavy Rain, it's an adventure game, kind of a crime thriller in a Fincher type universe. These are references. At the time, you have to put yourself back 10 years ago. There weren't that many adventure games. It was a super challenge to do a big AAA, really expensive game and focused on a narrative and a very cinematographic style. So it was a really major experience.
Voilà. Ça, c'est une des scènes que j'ai beaucoup aimé.
This is a scene that I really liked doing. I did the design. I worked with the cameraman. It was the first time in the studio we had. It wasn't the first time, but it was the beginning of when we had special camera operators. It was previously animators or designers who were framing. So it gives us a really strong cinema element. I wanted to do animated film afterwards, so I joined McGuff. They just had a little success known as Despicable Me. It was made in France. Nobody seems to know that, but I didn't work on Despicable Me. I worked for the Lorax, which worked less successful, you know, for the studio, but it's an adaptation of a book I really love. It's a Dr. Seuss book that any self-respecting English speaker knows and loves. So I worked on the layout, the whole staging. You're working with the director, framing, staging scenes. So it was really interesting to work on this 3D, see whether the scene works, so whether it's funny, whether it's touching. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to animated films. It's a little bit more colorful than Heavy Rain, lots of little bears.
Les poissons, donc ça c'est des plans que j'ai faits. Et Monsieur Lorax. Ensuite, donc travailler sur donc c'est des grosses productions.
Then I worked on major productions with MacDuff. They almost have 400 employees now, so really big films with hundreds of animators. And at the time when I was working on those films, it was the interactivity in video games that I missed, and the ability to offer something to the player that's interactive and they can really take part in the story. So I joined a new studio for a project called Remember Me. So it was called Nod Entertainment. It was a really big project for that studio. It was a AAA production, very expensive, with a very new studio. We had to create everything. So I was more involved with the filming aspect and the narration of the game. All the stuff that happens in the scenes and sequences, when you end up in the street, what happens. Great project with incredible people, Alan Damasio and others. So it's the very start of the studio, and we created this rich universe. As Jehanne was saying, creating a world for a game is really fantastic. You could do 50 games, 50 books, 50 films. If you follow the arc, actually, of these universes, when you see everything that we've created, but it's deceptive, actually, because you can't put everything into the game. So it's Paris in the future, an action game.
On tape sur des gens.
Hitting people, basically.
Mais aussi et surtout assez engagé.
But it's very engaged in its theme. Talks about memory, what we do with our souvenirs, our memories.
Tout l'aspect surconnecté.
The overconnected aspect that was arriving in our world at the time.
Superbe projet.
It was really a great project, and one of the aspects that was interesting was these memory remix sequences. So you get into somebody's mind, you modify their memory, and when they leave, their memory is modified and they have the feeling, you can make them do things or give them memories that change their behavior. So it's really interesting in terms of the staging and the gameplay and everything that it signifies, actually, philosophically speaking. There were really interesting sequences to create.
À la fin de ce jeu, donc
and at the end of the game, that wasn't very successful, actually. It was kind of a shame for us. One of the founders of Don't Nod offered a small team to create a game with this idea of going back in time, and we started working on Life is Strange.
Merci. Donc il y en a peut-être qu'on jouait. Donc du coup,
maybe some of you have played it.
Voilà, un jeu beaucoup plus narratif,
much more narrative game,
comparé à
film-like game.
Voilà, c'était un peu le souhait de cette équipe de base.
And what our basic team wanted to do was to create something focused on the characters and the narration, so a more simplified gameplay.
Donc voilà, je vais faire un petit trailer pour ceux qui n'ont pas vu.
So I'll just give you a little example of our trailer for those of you who haven't played it.
Voilà, donc Life is Strange.
So that was Life is Strange.
Moi, j'ai envie de refaire un petit peu d'animation.
I'd really like to do more animation.
Je crois que j'ai un petit truc sur.
I've got a couple of words quickly.
J'ai fait un petit peu de motion capture.
I did a bit of motion capture
pour Life is Strange.
Because I did it for Life is Strange, and I can talk about it later. And for Heavy Rain,
un petit projet qui arrive
there's a small project that's appeared called in France. A small project of Valerian.
Tout ce qui est mocap, et du coup ils avaient besoin de gens.
So for the mock-up and everything, they needed people, so it was really great. Maybe we could talk about it in the recap.
Voilà, Weta qui arrive, ça déménage. Donc voilà, mock-up, je pense que j'en reparlerai après sur le principe et
I could talk about the principle later on, but what has changed in terms of animation in video games, because it really made it possible to bring in a lot of simplicity. It makes it easier to create the characters in the games. So with the two buddies, we created our studio called Capsule, and we really love our logo up here. So Capsule, the people I work with, Stefan and Mamed, have been doing CGI for 10 years. The idea was to create our own studio so that we can do the stuff we like. So to start with, we're doing clips and video game trailers and advertising, of course, like any small studio that's starting up. We've been at it for a year and a half. We've done some extracts here. There's no sound on these. So I won't do the sound effects, but I'll just let you watch while I talk. So ads, trailers, a trailer for a game I can talk about later. Farming Simulator, which is a Swiss game. We did that with Giants. We loved it. The trailer that came out this year. The in-game cinematics. As Ian was saying earlier, that the games are really changing. We've got lots of in-game cinematics because we have these engines that are really joining the precision of a pre-calc. So it's really super interesting to have the back and forth between the two worlds. You see people like Mighty Dog things are re-rendered 1 frame per second. So this kind of interaction of the media, and then the feature-length animation. And some of the work is being done in game engines, actually. So with the pre-visualization and other elements, so it's really exciting to be in on that.
Donc ça c'est dernière actualité.
So this is the most recent news. Alongside Capsule Studios, I've been doing games with Don't Nod, and in the universe of Life is Strange, and so this is our most recent creation. It came out a month ago. It's completely free. So go right ahead and play. There's no excuse. If you play, you'll see that we kept stuff that we kept in Life is Strange, but by talking about other subjects. So I'll show you this little trailer.
Spirit of my silence, I can hear you, but I'm afraid to be near you, and I don't know where to begin, and I don't know where to begin.
It's just me, Captain Spirit. To the Flying Fortress. Have you spotted Snowmancer? Not yet. Keep me posted.
Chris, breakfast.
Okay, Dad. You're drinking beer?
I don't need a lecture from my son.
I always get picked last for the team at school, and they never throw the ball to me.
They can't tell stories like you can they?
No way. Start the launch. Too late! Emergency!
You're too weak to fight me.
This time, you won't get away from me.
It's alright.
I miss Mom's smile.
Me too.
Nobody's friend.
You're probably gonna change the world.
I hope so.
I know so.
Captain Spirit is here!
The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit. Download for free from June 26th.
Voilà, donc c'est gratuit, ça dure entre 1 heure,
It's free, it takes an hour or two to play, so really feel free to try. So that's my quick presentation, and I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about 2 or 3 projects and make parallels between games and films. And the creative process. So first, I'm going to talk about the cinematics that you saw from the search earlier.
Le process de création
the creative process for a film, whether it was in the Lorax, which is a feature film, or for trailers.
Comme de The Surge là que vous avez vu avec les exosquelettes, etc.
With the exoskeletons and Surge that you saw, it's a really classic process. We have a storyboard,
plan par plan,
and do shot by shot.
Tout de suite, voilà, un petit extrait d'un board.
Here's an extract of a storyboard.
Donc voilà, c'est un process, on écrit,
a process,
on
we
édite,
write,
etc., dialogue, on board ensuite ce que vous voyez là. Après, la prochaine étape, c'est la 3D, donc on commence à faire de la prévise.
That we start doing
layout ou prévise en 3D,
layout
ça permet de tester les
3D, which
séquences,
lets us test the sequences, and once the 3D sequences work,
on est satisfait avec
and
la
we're
musique, avec
satisfied
les voix,
with the music,
que le
the
rythme marche, là, on
voices,
va
and the
commencer à
pace is
rendre,
good, then we start
à créer
rendering,
vraiment les assets
and really
définitifs et à les
creating
rendre,
the definitive assets.
En précalculé définitivement. Donc c'est un process qui est assez itératif avant la création en tout cas des cadres, etc. Là où dans le jeu vidéo, après un tournage mocap, on travaille tout à l'heure sur la suspense, c'est vrai qu'on a une certaine liberté, c'est-à-dire qu'on a des animations qui sont là et on filme un peu comme on veut. Moi je borde très rarement quand on fait c'est les cadreurs en fait qui vont décider de la mise en scène. Donc c'est un process assez différent.
It's a different process actually in video games in terms of the cameraman and
ça prend des jours, enfin des heures en tout cas. Du coup, c'est clair que le moindre changement,
really a lot of hours or days. So every single change has to be. We have to be quite certain what we want because changes are so costly, and the 3D layout is so important.
À quoi ressemble le jeu de base en fait? Nous, par exemple, quand on fait un trailer.
And our process for doing trailers.
Un jeu qui est voilà. Pardon. Hop. Donc voilà, c'est là dans l'exemple de The Search, c'est ce qu'on appelle un soul light, c'est un peu ce qu'on fait les génies de Demon's Soul et Bloodborne. Là, c'est dans un univers SF, donc voilà, ça a des armures, ça se castagne, il faut qu'on puisse s'ajouter des armes sur soi, etc. Donc ça, c'était des choses, par exemple, dans le brief de base, où on discute avec les réalisateurs du jeu. Donc là, pour moi, c'est vrai que c'était assez intéressant, parce que je me retrouvais de l'autre côté à leur travailler avec des développeurs.
So it's really interesting to see what's really the heart of their game and what do they want to see in the trailer.
Et donc on arrive à la fin
we talk a lot and you end up with a film pitch. And so you see the assets.
Voilà, c'est du jeu vidéo temps réel.
It's a real-time video game with
de plus en plus importante, mais qui reste quand même
quality, but it remains
simple et où
simple.
Enfin, là où du CGI précalculé a une autre qualité.
Pre-calculated CGI has a different quality to it.
Donc ça c'est le trailer qu'on a fait.
This is the trailer that
vous
we
avez des assets du jeu, mais vous allez voir qu'on les a augmentés.
But we've augmented them. At least we hope that you can see that with regard to the quality.
Je sais pas si vous voyez.
Somebody special.
Je vais parler en même temps pour gagner un peu de temps.
Talk over this to save some time.
Donc là, dans ce genre de trailer, on a envie de montrer des choses, donc avoir
so we want to show stuff in our trailer.
Badass et qui fait envie aux joueurs.
Really badass and that makes somebody want to play it. It's a marketing tool, of course. So we really played that up, but we also wanted to show what the gameplay is like. So you can see they can pick up weapons
d'un robot qui l'a détruit, etc.
From a robot that they destroyed. All of the movements of the bad guys are game movements, and so how do you do something that's visually even more enticing, and so this is really an action game aspect. It's kind of like a simulator, and so really, how do you get people to want to discover a new game? And there are a lot of limitations, but creatively, you can do some interesting stuff.
Voilà pour The Surge.
So that's the Surge.
Dex13 du coup, qui sont allemands, donc super dev. Et je vais vous montrer aussi une autre étape.
I want to show you another stage that I really like, which is the color key.
Donc ça c'est un artiste, c'est Paul Chadesson.
This is another artist who's worked with us on Remember Me.
Là, c'est plus une fois qu'on a
this is another time. Once again, you see this rhythm that you saw on our storyboard. You're going to start to see what you're going to have in the film.
À quoi on veut, enfin, comment on veut que chaque séquence soit ressentie par le joueur.
Sequence to be felt by the player, which is really communicated through the colors. You find some of these images in the film, not all of them, but you want to see the important steps and what we want to bring forward, the strong points. It's a really classic process.
Pour reparler de Lorax, par exemple, c'est exactement la même chose.
If we talk about the Lorax, we did the same things. We did lots of color keys that were fantastic.
Parce que c'est vraiment, voilà, c'est de la peinture, donc c'est vraiment
assez
fabuleux à voir.
Fantastic to see.
Donc voilà, c'est un process assez classique
de création creative process with regard to animated film anyway.
Je vais si j'ai d'autres trucs à dire, non. Je vais vous montrer maintenant des choses.
And now I want to show you some stuff from Life is Strange.
J'ai envie de dire, posez-moi des questions et tout, mais on fera ça après.
I want you to ask me questions, but I will wait. So in Life is Strange, this is the art book, so we can talk about the process. As Jehanne was saying, a game isn't just you write a story and characters, and you put some gameplay in it, and it's done. It's really what's in the world, what connects the characters, what justifies the story.
crucial parce que
these are
c'est
critical
tous ces petits détails qui vont
stages. It's
faire
all
que
those
l'univers va être
details
cohérent et que
that
le
make
joueur
the
aussi aura
universe
envie
coherent and make
de
the
continuer.
player want to continue in it.
Nous, sur Life is Strange, là, en tout cas,
So in Life is
ce projet était
Strange,
ancré
the
dans
project was
dans un background réaliste.
rooted in
Ça
a
se passe
realistic
en Oregon, aux
background.
États-Unis.
It takes
Donc là,
place
c'est
in
beaucoup de
Oregon in
recherche,
the US, so
comme
lots
en
of
cinéma, hein,
research,
c'est
like in film.
de la documentation, on va sur place,
Documenting,
on prend des photos, on fait des
doing
interviews, etc. C'est énormément de recherche. Là, pour
location
Life is Strange, typiquement, on veut
searches, and
surtout pas être
in Life is
les vieux
Strange,
Français,
we don't want to be these,
trentenaires qui font un truc sur des
pathetic
ados aux
French
États-Unis
people who
et
are
qui
doing
font
stories about US
n'importe quoi. Il y a
teenagers
vraiment
who
des
do complete
clichés
crap.
qu'on a mis en place, qu'on
So
s'est fait
there are all
bâcher très
these
vite par notre
clichés that we put
écrivain
forward, and we got
américain,
ourselves,
voilà,
we
parce
got
qu'on a des choses en
knocked
tête,
down
aux
by
États-Unis,
our
c'est comme
US
ça.
writer.
Non, pas du tout. Pour un
And said,
univers
like, this
SF,
is completely
c'est
wrong,
pareil,
you know, and
est-ce
for a
que,
science fiction universe, it's
par
the
exemple, cette
same.
nouvelle télé, ce nouveau
Will this new
casque virtuel
TV,
est
this
logique?
new
Est-ce qu'il marche
virtual
vraiment?
headset
On se
work?
pose
Is it
tout le temps un peu les
logical?
mêmes questions. Est-ce que ça fonctionne
You're
dans
always
l'univers?
asking this
Donc là, vous voyez
question,
des
does this
recherches
work
qui ont été
in
faites.
the
Là, par
universe
exemple,
that
c'est
we've
des
done?
concept
So
art de
this is
chambre.
art
Vous pouvez
concept
reconnaître
for
celle
the
de
rooms
Chloé,
that you might
celle de
recognize. So
Max.
Chloe's
Donc
room, Max's room.
beaucoup de détails, c'est très important,
Lots
surtout
of
pour le type
details.
de jeu qu'on
It's
fait
super
qui est
important,
assez lent,
especially for the kind
où
of game that
c'est
we do, which
beaucoup
is quite
d'exploration,
slow, where there's
de
lots of
petites interactions pour
exploring,
découvrir des choses du
with
décor. Donc c'est très important
small
que
interactions,
le
so
joueur
you
soit remercié s'il
discover
est
elements
curieux.
of the set.
Donc voilà, vous pouvez voir quelques petits arts. Ça,
Yes,
c'est
and
des
some
extraits
of the art from it.
du livre de concept art. Donc vous voyez tous les pareils, les
Extracts from
costumes,
the concept art book, the costumes,
les habits des personnages,
the clothes,
l'idée, c'est
basically.
d'être assez
For
cohérent et de
you
raconter
have to
beaucoup
be
de choses.
quite
Donc là, vous voyez, par
coherent
exemple, la
and tell a
chambre
lot of stories. So you see in
Victoria.
Victoria's
Donc on voit
room,
tout de suite
you
une différence.
immediately
C'est
see
vrai que
the
pour le joueur, c'est important
difference.
de se
For the
rendre compte
player, you have to
d'être
be
dans
able
un
to
environnement réaliste, en
identify.
même temps d'apprendre des
It
choses
has to
sur
be a
les
realistic
personnages et sur
environment, but
l'univers.
also learn things
Donc
about the
toujours des
characters and
concepts avec
their
les
worlds.
personnages. Donc
Character
le
concepts.
processus de création,
The
traduction
creative
du jeu vidéo, je disais,
process
qui est un peu différent de l'anime.
in video
C'est que
games,
là, on
which
va
is different
écrire
from
un
animation,
scénario, donc
is
avec
that you
Jean-Luc
could
Cano, qui est notre scénariste sur Life is Strange.
when you work on the screenplay,
Là, mais tant pis.
the scenario.
Donc on écrit avec lui, avec Michel.
We write
qui
with
co-réalise
Michel,
Cork,
who co-directs the
on
games
écrit
with
tous les
me.
trois, on essaie d'avoir
We
une
all
trame
three
narrative qui nous
write.
plaît, des thèmes
We get
et
a
des
narrative
personnages qui nous plaisent.
tone and theme
Et à
and
partir de
characters that we
là,
like.
lui va écrire
And then
une arche, pardon.
we're going to write a narrative
Nous,
arc.
après, on va reprendre et redigérer. Et
And then we're going to redigest that and insert interactivity and gameplay in there. And what's interesting for us is that we have that foundation that's written by the scenario writer and the scriptwriter who's created these characters in this world, but we have to make it interactive and interesting to play, and that's the process that we engage. Once the sequences are written and we've included the puzzles and gameplay, then we shoot in motion capture, and once we've got our mocap images, then we frame them in game and so on. So it's a process that's different from animation, where you can iterate, for instance, from the motion capture, we can adapt the staging for what we want to do. More concept art, details. When you create a city, even if it's realistic, it's completely fictional. So you've really got to create everything, the city sign, the landscape.
Voilà, toujours pareil, les dessins
Again, drawings that correspond to the characters, tell stories. These pictures, here you can see already small, blueprint of a house, everything is realistic. The idea, if you're going to furnish a house like Chloe's, you're going to go check things out on eBay to see, what kind of furniture you might be able to buy with their budget, what kind of house they could have, what kind of car they might have. We really have to do all that research, even though they're very small details. People say that might be a lot of work for not much result, but it is what makes the universe coherent. For a film, it's even more the case. And this is what brings the two fields closer. Drawings by Alison Bui. Fantastic drawings. All the details we see everywhere that give the character depth.
Je vais peut-être vous montrer rapidement la mocap et après je vais parler de la musique. Donc quelques petits docs de design un peu comme ça.
A few design documents you can see.
C'est tout petit.
Oh, this is really small. So here's
c'est une des scènes
a scene
avec
we have
un design à la branche.
with
Donc
a
c'est une écriture qui est un
designer.
peu différente.
It's a writing that's a bit different.
Faire un film d'animation court
If you're doing
linéaire,
a short to
c'est
linear
facile,
animated
linéaire.
film, it's quite easy, quote unquote
C'est juste
easy.
là, on a énormément de branches. Donc,
But
je
here we
parle
have
même
lots
pas
of
du
branching,
RPG.
things that branch
C'est,
off.
je sais pas comment
Not
on
even
fait pour
talking
faire
about
ça, mais en tout cas,
a role-play
c'est,
game. I have no
beaucoup de
idea how you
branches
even
qui
write
se croisent,
that.
nous, on a aussi
But we
beaucoup
have
de
lots of
branches, de
branches
choix et conséquences, mais
and lots
voilà,
of
on
choices
revient
of
toujours sur un
sequence,
espèce
but
de
you
fil
always come back to this kind
qui est
of
notre
main
histoire,
line,
pour
which
se
is
tenir
our
au
story.
personnage, donc voilà, c'est quand même un peu de boulot, mais
There's a lot of work involved,
donc,
but
vous voyez,
you
voilà,
know,
c'est beaucoup de facts qui sont pris en compte.
lots of
Et souvent, on
facts
peut
that are
faire des
taken
choses.
into
Vous voyez, ça
account.
revient quand même souvent sur
And we come back often
disons, la ligne rouge,
to the
enfin, la ligne
main
principale de
story,
l'histoire,
or the
mais en même temps, il y a, là, on
story.
voit pas, c'est une scène en particulier, hein, mais il y a des scènes qui
There are
qui disparaissent
scenes
ou qui reviennent
that
avec des
disappear
personnages
and
qui
then
disparaissent,
come
qui
back
reviennent.
again, characters that
Voilà,
disappear and come
etc.
back.
Ça, c'est pour une scène de, je crois que c'est la confrontation avec
This is
Frank,
the confrontation with
en
Frank.
particulier. Ah, peut-être ça, voilà, c'est ça. Donc ça, par exemple, pareil, c'est voilà, des heures de plaisir. Du coup,
This
beaucoup
is-
de
this
cas
represents
où, là, par
hours
exemple,
of
c'est la scène
fun,
avec
let me
Frank
tell
dans
you.
l'épisode 4, où tout ce que vous avez fait pendant
So
4
that
épisodes,
everything that
vient
you've done
ici et
for
va
4
faire des changements
episodes, they're going to
sur la
make
mise en scène avec,
changes in the
on peut voir des
staging,
sorties, pour le coup, très différentes.
and so you see these very different
Avec, voilà,
results.
des scènes où Frank peut mourir ou pas.
Or scenes in which Frank
des
will
changements,
die
enfin,
or
voilà,
not
plein
die,
de
or
outcomes différents.
lots of different
Voilà,
outcomes.
ça c'est un peu le design. Donc quand on tourne par exemple en motion capture,
So when we
on
shoot
essaie
in
de
motion
tourner le
capture,
maximum de possibilités.
we
Là
shoot
où,
as many
évidemment, sur un film
possibilities as we
classique,
can.
on va
On
tourner
a
une
classic
seule scène,
film,
elle
you
marche,
shoot
et
one
après on
scene.
va la filmer.
When
Là,
it's done and
c'est
finished, it works.
un peu différent. Il
It's
faut
over.
penser
In
au
a
raccord, penser
video
au
game, you have to
gameplay
think
aussi.
of
Donc,
the
on gameplay, est-ce que c'est logique?
connections, the
Si on commence
cuts.
une interaction avec un
If you
objet,
start with an interaction
est-ce que,
with another
est-ce qu'on va
character,
être raccord avec l'animation qu'on aura
will
tournée,
it
etc.
be in will it flow with the animation we've created and so on?
Mocap très rapidement.
I'll have to go even
parce que ça,
faster
c'est
to
pas
make
des
it in
trucs
my
que j'aime
time.
souvent, du coup, tant qu'à faire. Voilà, donc ça c'est les premiers tournages.
So
donc
these
c'est
are the
dans un
first
garage.
shoots
Voilà,
in a
vous pouvez reconnaître, pour
garage.
ceux qui ont joué à Life is
You
Strange,
can recognize
c'est
if you've
Chloé.
played Life in Stretch,
Voilà.
that's Chloe.
Vous voyez ici, donc
Here you
pour la
can
mocap, ceux qui ne connaissent
see
pas, donc c'est
if in motion capture, if you don't know it.
Voilà, là vous voyez, on voit bien, il y a un
You
flash.
can see
Du coup, ça
that
fait
there's a flash.
sortir les capteurs. Donc
It
maintenant, c'est
makes
assez
the
connu, la
centers
motion capture.
pretty
C'est utilisé
clear.
partout.
People
Donc, vous voyez,
know
c'est pas du
about
tout
motion
comme Avatar.
capture.
Et un
It's
peu
used
moins de
everywhere.
budget.
It's not like
Non,
Avatar.
c'est
We
le même
don't have
principe,
that budget,
c'est-à-dire
but
qu'on
it's the
envoie
same principle.
la caméra envoie un infrarouge
The
sur
camera gets an
un
infrared
capteur qui
light on
brille
a
ici
sensor
et
that
récupère
glows, and it
boule.
recovers those
Et
little
si 3 caméras
points.
voient la boule, ils peuvent la placer dans l'espace.
If 3 cameras see the dot, then they can place
Ça,
it
c'est
in
les gens du canot, le
space.
scénario dont je vous parlais, comme ça il sera content, il sera un peu là. Ça, une des scènes de Max dans sa
This
chambre.
is a scene of Max in his room playing music. Some of the stuff we did with the music, and you can see here, you don't see it very clearly, but there are little red dots that are equivalent to the 2 actresses in the background in a set that you can see kind of symbolically realized in 3D. So we position the bodies that help the actors act, basically.
J'avais des petits docs là, je peux vous montrer.
These small documents I could show you. Looks like a screenplay. Looks like an a screenplay for an animation.
Voilà, sauf que nous on va avoir
except that we
des facts à
are
prendre en
going
compte,
to have facts that we have to take into account.
C'est un peu plus compliqué à tourner, encore une fois, il faut arriver à être raccord.
So of course it's harder to shoot to bring 2 separate branches back together and for them to merge.
Avoir des moods différents, quelqu'un qui est
You
énervé,
can have different moods with people who are annoyed or calm. We'll try to shoot it once and it works in both for both cases, or we're going to have to shoot both the sequences several times. Both of the various options. Sorry, I'm going so fast. But
voilà, ça, vous voyez le personnage qui bouge.
So you can see the character moving.
Ça, il joue David là.
He's playing David.
Vous voyez qu'il bouge dans l'écran en bas.
You can see him moving in the screen below.
C'est juste pour montrer, parce que je sais qu'on ne voit pas. J'ai retrouvé cette vidéo, voilà. Donc
I found this video, and we're working here. Here we are at work.
L'actrice qui fait Max à
gauche. The actress playing Max is on the left, and Sebastian is recording the sound. So you see the little moving red dots. Those are in real time.
On a envie de montrer qu'on est un studio d'animation.
So we want to show you that we're an animation studio where
ou Avengers ou ce que vous avez vu.
When you can see like the adventures.
Il y a beaucoup de travail d'animation quand même.
There's like really a lot of animation work behind motion capture, and you have post-animation and retreating the data. And you see from the very start there's a lot of data that's present, and it gives information to the actors. And for us to work with actors on that is great, because it really saves us heaps of time. If you had to animate this, Life is Strange is 8.5 hours of cinematics, so you can imagine if we had to animate the characters all the way through, the armies of animators we'd need. So with motion capture you really save a lot of time, and it really contributes something to the characters, because you get a very clear body language. And it really matters for people who will play Captain Spirit. We shot with a kid, and that child contributes something unique to the game. And again, music, very quickly.
Permettre à David d'enchaîner.
So we're going to leave some time for David and to continue on the music. So in Life is Strange we have two uses of music. In Captain Spirit I'm not going to show you too much, but just two examples. We have a scored music, as Olivier de Rivière does. With Spiders, it's music that's created for the game, and it's interactive. But then I had a choice in Life is Strange. We have licensed music, elements that exist either in the story, a teenager who's listening to music in their room, and that tells something, or it kind of it decorates a scene. You know, you have a car driving through the snow in a blizzard, and you add music. You know, purchasing licensed music contributes something more to the game. It's something that already been done. If you've played other games, you might have, in a game where you arrive in Mexico, and you Speak Up the Line that have also done this. Quite a number of games that have done these techniques, and we're really happy to do it a little bit more.
Un peu plus dans les jeux concrets. Donc ici,
so here in the gameplay, it's a really simple example. Chris,
sa mère ne vit plus.
His mother is no longer alive. He's living alone with his dad. He puts on a disc that reminds him of his mother.
Du coup, ça, voilà, c'est typiquement un morceau qu'on va acheter, qu'on va mettre dans la scène.
Music that we're going to purchase and put into the sequence.
C'est que c'est interactif. C'est-à-dire que c'est le joueur
qui décide de mettre la musique là ou pas. Player who will decide to put that music on or not. To really simple zero level interaction. The player puts the record on, stops it when they want, or they continue to play.
Donc ça permet d'avoir plein de moments où, comme ado ou comme
so there are lots of elements. When you're a teen or a child, you put music on and do stuff in your room. So we really have to have you have to choose the right music to create a realistic environment. I want to talk about one more use of music, so to be quicker and quicker. So we had Sufjan Stevens, who let us use some of his music in Captain Spirit, so it became a bit of the score of the game.
Au morceau, et on a pu du coup l'utiliser.
We were able to use his music, and we could use it in a number of places.
Désolé, je lis en direct. Vous l'avez entendu sur le trailer, et là c'est l'intro du jeu.
And here's the game introduction. It's really a great song by Sufjan Stevens. He's a fantastic singer if you don't know him. He talks about his mother.
Captain Spirit, on parle beaucoup de ça, du deuil, etc.
And of course we're talking a lot about grief in our game, so it lets you to have another reading of our game. So I'm really happy that he was willing to be associated with our game. What's a bit different is that we'll have notes from that song throughout the game, depending on what the player does. There are 3 stanzas in the song, and as we learn the story of his mother, depending on how the player plays it, they'll have key moments of the game that are accompanied by this music. So this is when he goes into his tree house by himself. He sees the drawings of his mom, drawings by his mom, because she was an artist. So here's the player who who chooses, and depending on what they do, the music comes in or not. So what we do in combat games, and what Olivier did in the spider games, if you're losing in a combat, we're going to put layered music that's going to put pressure on you. Or we might add another layer. The idea for us here was to use that less in a narrative game. So you can hear the second stanza here. And the third one is harder to find, and it's if you find the souvenirs that are related to his mother, and then you really understand. There's a bit of a labyrinth. I'll let you discover it, but we're going to discover a personal treasure. Like any child, we've got hidden stuff. And once again, you get the music again, and here we understand. It's only in that part of the song that you understand the whole story. So we had constraints because the song exists, so we had to use it as is, but how could we use it in the interactivity of the gameplay?
Voilà, je ne vais pas tout... Là, attention. Voilà, je vous laisserai découvrir ça dans le jeu. Hop. Voilà, et sinon, un dernier petit point sur la musique.
So one last thing, you can discover all of that on your own, but just one word about the music in Life is Strange.
Processus que j'ai beaucoup aimé mettre en place, c'était que dans sa chambre, du coup,
a process that I really liked implementing in his room. Max has a guitar, and you can use music. You can either put something on the turntable, or you can here have Gonzalez who plays. Max could play the guitar, and if you turn on her hi-fi, she wanders around the room. But otherwise, if you pick up the guitar, she does just a couple of notes. But if you've got music going on the hi-fi, she's not just going to pick out a few notes, so she's going to try to play along with the music that's on the hi-fi. And she'll play the way any teen would try to play over an existing song. So if the player is curious and tests things and tests all kinds of interactivity, if you interact with the objects, you get a compensation of these interesting sound layers that play on top of the music that's on the hi-fi. So I think that's all I need to say, and thanks a lot.
It is with the utmost pleasure that I welcome here Mr. David Wise. C'est avec un grand plaisir que j'accueille ici Monsieur David Wise, composer at Rare Studio. He worked on a lot of games. He's got a portfolio of around 100 games. Monsieur Wise a travaillé sur plus d'une centaine de jeux durant sa carrière. J'en citerai que quelques-uns, les plus célèbres étant évidemment la série des Donkey Kong Country, on l'a aussi vu sur Diddy Kong Racing sur Nintendo 64, sur Star Fox Adventure, Battletoads, si on remonte évidemment beaucoup plus loin, et puis plus récemment sur des jeux auxquels vous avez pu jouer, notamment Snake Pass, Yooka-Laylee, Tengami et autres. Merci beaucoup, David Wise. Thank you very much for your presence, and we're really looking forward to hearing you.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Merci beaucoup and vielen Dank. So the rest is in English. Sorry, I beg your pardon. So as you saw, when people like your game scores, they very kindly invite you abroad and have these big orchestras, and they'll play it for you, and it's great PR, I must say. And thank you to the Tokyo Philharmonic, because that makes a great PR trailer for me. So. There we go. That was from Donkey Kong Country 2, and as a lot of my work has involved Donkey Kong from the Donkey Kong series for Nintendo, I'm going to talk about really a lot of that, and also how I got to that point as well of writing for them. So for anyone who doesn't know who I am or what I do, obviously I write music primarily for video games, and I think Sam had mentioned that you'd like to talk about what I do in a day, and it varies, to be honest. The best days are the days where I can have uninterrupted time and talk on my, and just concentrate for 3 or 4 hour periods, preferably 2 of those, and just shut myself away from the whole world and concentrate. However, there are other days like today where I get to be invited all the way over to Switzerland instead of being in the UK, in a nice mountainous village with lakes, and it's great to come and talk to you all. However, I'm going to, the last game that was released is on the Nintendo Switch, and it is Tropical Freeze. So this is, after all that work, this is what comes out, and hopefully what you get to play if you buy the game. So I'm going to talk about some of my influences in a minute. I'd like to say that I spend a lot of time working on my own. Absolutely nobody but me. And when you work on your own, your social skills do tend to disappear. It takes a lot of time to, and then by contrast, the juxtaposition is I'm here talking to all of you and lots of people. So you go from talking to nobody to talking to lots of people. So you'll have to bear with the transition just for a few minutes. Now, I think it's interesting to know where composers have come from. What were their influences when they were kids, and why do they compose the music that they do? So these were my influences. One of my big influences was Phil Collins. I played drums, I played keyboards, and I started as a teenager writing songs. And we do have one thing in common, but there we go. Now, the other two people here is Diane Warren. I don't know if anybody has heard of Diane Warren. I think one of her most famous tracks is by Aerosmith, and it's I Don't Want to Miss a Single Thing. But she has written hundreds of tracks, absolutely hundreds. And she did Beyonce's I Was Here, which was after the 9/11 attacks. And the other chap is Desmond Child, another band that I liked when I was in my teens. They were called Bon Jovi, and Desmond Child wrote most of their hits. Things like You Give Love a Bad Name and Living on a Prayer. He also wrote the stuff for Ricky Martin. So he was a really big influence on me. I used to listen to these two songwriters loads and loads and loads and try and recreate what they did. They were my biggest influences. So when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager, sorry, I wanted to be a rock star. It didn't work out. However, because of what I was doing, somebody asked me if I'd write video games, and I've got one of those kind of cliche type of breaks into my career. So when I'd left school, in fact, my background is that I had piano lessons when I was a child. Mum sent me off to piano lessons, so I'd sit there for hours playing the piano. And then I got bored with playing the piano, and I decided I'd play the trumpet. And Mum, being very thoughtful, thought, well, you need to go and really play in a band. So she'd found a brass band. And I wanted to play jazz and improvise, but no, Mum thought the discipline of playing with 30 other people would be very good. So she was right, but it did take a bit of adjusting. And then eventually I got bored with playing brass band music because I wanted to be a rock star. So whilst I was in the brass band, I decided I'd learn drums. I wanted to play drums because that looked like the most interesting thing in a brass band. And you sit there at the back and play away. I was way too loud for the brass band. I left and decided to go and join an orchestra. And that was a bit of a mistake too, because when you're playing percussion in an orchestra, you've got to wait, you've got to read music, and there's a lot of waiting around. And I can remember at one concert, there I was counting all the bars. There were about 104 bars before this big cymbal crash that came in a bar too early. I left very shortly after that. However, after that, I went to work in a music shop. And I was still playing drums, and it was quite a big music shop. Music shops in those days were quite big. And I was upstairs trying to sell drums, but nobody was really interested in playing drums, and for good reason. They're very heavy. You've got to turn up to the gig before everybody else does, and you're still packing your kit down when everybody else has left or is talking. So that was a very bad idea. But fortunately, whilst I was working there, this chap from Yamaha came in, and he'd got, in that far corner there, it's a Yamaha CX-5. And that was probably one of the first music computers, but it wasn't the first, but it was the first commercial one. And the rep came in and said, well, we need somebody to demonstrate these keyboards. These are the future. So I figured that was a good way to get downstairs, because life was much better downstairs. You got to talk to people. You got to sell stuff as well. So I took this computer home at weekends, and I figured it out. Excuse me, my phone is pinging. Do apologise. There we go, that's got rid of that. I've lost my thread now. So yes, I took this keyboard, the computer home, and it's got an FM chip in it, which is impossibly hard to program. It's a 4 type thing. It's very hard, but I persevered and I learned how to use the computer. And it got MIDI on. MIDI, does anybody use MIDI at all? Are there any composers or musicians in the audience here? Okay, we've got a few, so a few people know what I'm on about. It's got this 5-pin MIDI thing, and it means that you can take one lead and you can hook it up to another lead. So whilst I was in the shop, I used this thing, no, that thing over there, and it's a sequencer. And you can take your MIDI lead out, you can plug it into lots of different keyboards, and you can play lots of tunes. And back in the day, going back to Phil Collins again, I could play lots of Genesis stuff on these keyboards and demonstrate it. And people used to come in and they used to go, oh, wow, that's great, fortunately. And they used I used to sell loads of those CX-5s and all the other kit. And I was playing, has anyone heard of Go West? They were sort of from the 80s as well. I was demonstrating Go West as well. So at one point, these two gentlemen, they decided that they wanted some kit. So I was doing my normal kind of presentation, playing Phil Collins, Genesis, Go West. And they said, well, do you know any more songs? And I said, sadly, no, I've run out of material, but I've got a couple of others that I've made it myself because I wanted to be a rock star. So I started playing them, very embarrassed by it, but they persevered and they got to the end. And one of them turned to the other and he said, monsters. And I thought, monsters? What does that mean? He said, well, it sounds like monsters. That's great. And they said, did you write that yourself? And I said, yes. So they, oh, okay. And they carried on talking. And eventually they said, well, we're going to buy all of this equipment, which they did. And they said, do you have an office? So I thought, brilliant. They're going to be on finance. We've sold a whole load more gear. So we went upstairs to the office and they said, can we offer you a job? So they left with the gear and me. So, and that were those two gentlemen, they are Tim and Chris Stamper, who are on that side. And their company was called Rare Limited, which a couple of you may have heard of. So it was there that I started my career in-house writing music. Now, all the gear that you've just seen, it sounded quite good in the 80s. So they said, well, write some tunes. My first 2 weeks actually was spending all my time playing Mario. I did nothing but play Mario. Then after that, they said, well, we need some tunes for these games we're writing. So I used all of my expensive gear that they'd purchased a few weeks before and made all of these great sounding demos. And then they told me it was going to be on the Nintendo NES. Now, the Nintendo NES sounds like a doorbell. And not only that, all the MIDI stuff that I'd been used to using, well, we couldn't use any of that either. It all had to be programmed in hex, computer code. So there'd be a number for the note, and there'd be another number for how long it lasted. And I'd have to type it out for each channel, and it took days. You know, rather than bumping something out in 2 hours, it would take a week to get something that sounded like a doorbell. But that was the start of my career. So, this was me. Time hasn't been kind, has it? There's the Rare logo, and that was me. In the early days, I was on contract, so I actually worked at home. And as you can see there, we've got a little computer, and it's an Amstrad. If anybody is as old as me, you might remember that Amstrad, and it had probably 64K, no, maybe even less, of memory. And we thought that was huge in those days. And I'd have to beaver away. I'd play something on my keyboard, write it all out, note length, which note length, and then a few subroutines, all programmed in 6502, this ancient language. And after days, maybe a week, we'd get a tune. And then I'd play it to people, and they'd kind of nod their heads appreciatively, and it went on like that for quite some time. Now, I had to suffer that for several years, writing NES stuff, and in a few seconds, you are going to suffer it too. You are going to hear my very first tune. So it was called Slalom. It was a skiing game. Fortunately, involved with that skiing game, we all had to go skiing to La Plagne in France and learn how to ski, just for influence. It was very nice. And since then, I've been skiing every year. I love skiing. Although, just to digress for a second, for the first 3 days, I was absolutely rubbish. I didn't know what to do. I had the worst skiing teacher in the world. However, on day 4, I got to the top of the mountain, left the ski teacher behind, and got down that slope at least 4 times before the rest of the ski school did. And then I just forgot the ski school, and I've been off skiing ever since. And following that experience, I wrote this really, really basic tune that you are going to be completely underwhelmed with. Actually, that's enough of that. I can't bear any more. Now that NES chip, it had 4 notes. It had a bass note which really sounded like an owl hooting. And it had 2 very noises as well. And they were your chords. And then it had this tsh, and that was your drums. But you could pitch that slightly differently. So you get tsh, tsh, and that you'd have to make your rhythms out of that. So it was quite basic. And although it seemed limiting at the time, what it did show me was how to make the best out of 4 notes. It also taught me a lot about how the brain perceives music and hears sounds. And we don't hear much at all. We can only really concentrate on one thing at a time. So if we're doing that, we better make sure it sounds good. And the other thing I learned, obviously we've just listened to a very basic static piece of music playing 4 notes, is that music relies on movement to make it work. You've got to get those static notes and do something with them. So I had to kind of work it out because I was listening to all of these very talented Japanese composers, and they were doing something much better than I could at the time. So I had to really knuckle down and learn what they were doing. And there's a lot of programming involved. So I really had to learn how to give music movement, to stop putting delays in things, to make it dance along, to learn about rhythm and how that needs to bounce along to give it movement. And once you've got movement in music, people like to listen to it a bit more. So after a few years of typing these very basic doorbell pieces of music, I managed to make it sound fairly decent for a doorbell. Fortunately, things moved on. We had the Super NES, which had 8 samples, and we only had 64K on that, but at least we had noises that didn't sound like that. And that moved on a bit, and then we got to more advanced consoles, and today we can use, well, I use this computer. This is one of my dev systems. I've got a studio at home. And in that studio, I've got lots of computers, and I can hook all the computers up together and use their combined processing power. And hopefully, when it's all working well, things do tend to sound at least a little more bearable these days. So that's Tropical Freeze. Again, it's out on the Switch if anybody wants to go and buy it. It's a good game, honestly. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about is the difference between video game composition and film composition. And I think it's really the implementation that's different. You've still got to create those basic themes that people want, those main themes. But in in video game music, especially if it becomes interactive, that means the music changes depending on where you are in the level, which means you've got to write many, many, many more versions of the same tune. When you're doing a film, it goes from A to B, you know what's going to happen, it gets from there to there in that time, and I find that quite, it's a lot more linear to write. It seems to be easier, but in a video game, anything can happen. So this piece of music that you've got that might last 2 minutes might have to change several times. It might need several endings, or it might have to transition to lots of different music. Or when it gets really clever or overcomplicated, they want different stems. So they'll have the percussion or the drums on one, and they might have the brass on another, depending where you are. So it can get really, really complicated, sometimes overly complicated, unnecessarily complicated. But films, I think, are nice because you get the theme and there's not too much. And one of the downsides about having so many differences or so many possibilities is that instead of writing music, you're basically producing or reproducing your own music, and it sort of takes some of the joy out of it. I think the good thing about music is when you're creating something, and you've got that initial inspiration, you're excited, you've seen the graphics on screen, you think, I know what to do. But when you're doing interactive music, yeah, you know what to do, and then you've got to do it 20 or 30 times. So in the good old days, you'd probably have one tune to fit all, but that's different from a film because once you start playing your level, it's got to account for many things. So it's like more like when an artist does kind of big broad brushstrokes, it's doing that kind of thing rather than something very, very specific. And also, as you see here, when we, instead of just using computers and typing away, sometimes you get to play with an orchestra as well, and that's really good fun. Now, going back to the Super NES, obviously that's the bit that really kind of did quite well for me. And going back to the songwriting bit, really, every now and again, people take your stuff that you did years ago, 20, 25 years ago, and they do something different with it. Now, this next video is probably about 8 or 9 years ago when I first saw it. It could have been out before that. But they kind of made a pastiche of my music here.
I'm so scared that I'll never get put back together. Yeah, you're breaking me in, and this is how we will love with you and me.
Playing Donkey Kong? Bramble Scramble, man, that level's hard. Now you gotta, yeah. Why make that level so hard? That music is dope though.
Yo, the more I grow up and get my life on track, the more I feel myself getting pulled back. The unbeatable odds that I'm facing got me thinking it's a game that I can't win. Like back when I was in school and they released Donkey Kong Country 2. That was a hard-ass game. I never beat it, and I ain't been the same. So when the stress starts pulling me under, I start feeling like I'm back in the jungle, trying to stack bananas like building blocks. Might go ape shit on a million crocs. Grab that barrel and put him to bed. Hit a motherfucking bumblebee over the head. Bad guys stay on cadence like a drum line. I guess life is that way sometimes.
Sometimes life is impossible, like that one level with the thorns and shit. With reptile pirates get the upper hand. I can't understand why'd you make this level so hard. But I try to make this level so hard. I got a whole bunch of bananas, but I ain't trying nothing for this level. I got a whole bunch of bananas, but I ain't trying nothing for this. I got a whole bunch of bananas, but I ain't trying nothing for answers. Got a whole bunch of bananas.
What do you want to do today?
Man, I was thinking...
It was just one of those things that made me laugh. And going back to the songwriting at the beginning, is the tunes that I did back on the Super NES seem to have wound their way into modern culture. So people like Drake, they've used some of my samples, and Childish Gambino, and suddenly, in my later years in life, I'm becoming hip. I am in the charts in America. I've had 4 top 10 hits in the last 4 years without doing a single thing. Sadly, I'm no millionaire because the music belongs to Nintendo, and as it was a buyout, it was, I'll just have to be a poor musician for the rest of my life. Having said that, I am working with a few producers around the world doing a bit of hip-hop, so you never know, maybe. Now, unlike the first 2 presentations from Jehanne and Raoul, I noticed that my music, or the games that I actually compose for, tend not to be quite as dramatic. So they're not fantasy, really, and they're not kind of realistic. They tend to involve furry animals. And the next game is no exception. It's Sumo Digital. They phoned me up a couple of years ago, and they said, would you like to come and do some work for us? And they were doing a 3D platform for the Switch, and it's also on Steam. You can, anyway, the guy who's standing next to me there, the tall chap, he's called Seb. He comes from Amsterdam, and he's a really, really good kind of physics programmer. And he managed to get this snake and kind of make it feel realistic. Technically, it's very interesting. And I think it makes for a great game. And what it was, they wanted it to be South American, so everything's kind of woody. And there's acoustic guitars in there, there's flutes in there because they're all made out of wood. The percussion is bamboo, so there's lots of shakers and there's lots of marimbas that are bamboo as well. So just to give you a flavour of what Snake Pass is and how I did it, this is what it ends up sounding like. Now, we're keeping these sessions down to half an hour, which is a very digestible amount of time. And I was going to show you a door project, but that would probably take 10 or 20 minutes, maybe even longer, and just break down how I go about composing music, but perhaps something for another time. I'm not sure, perhaps later in the Q&A. So I'm just going to show you, as the final thing, I found some samples on the CD, and a lot of Tropical Freeze is set in savannah in Africa, which incidentally is where my son is now. He's on an expedition for 4 weeks in the savannah in Africa. However, I digress. We got all these vocal samples from African choirs, and we put them all together. And Yamamoto-san, who was in charge of the project, said, well, we don't want to use the original choirs if at all possible. What we want to do is have custom samples. So we got all the staff in Kyoto together, and they have choirs over there. So we got them all together, and they are the choir in one of the pieces in Tropical Freeze. And they did this awesome job of recreating this African savanna sound for all of the vocal parts. So without further ado, and just to finish, this is what they came up with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for everything. And we will start the Q&A session. Donc, on va commencer avec la table ronde. Donc, je vais réaccueillir Monsieur Raoul Barbet et Madame Jehanne Rousseau ici, et puis and Mr. Wise, of course, for the Q&A session. So you can sit wherever you like, and we might take some time to check the mic, and if everything is all right. So we did talk a lot, and I think it might also be a good time for everyone to ask questions. I, of course, have questions to ask the panel, but feel free if there's really something you want to ask. If there's a question that's been ticking you, feel free to ask it to our panel as quickly as possible, since we don't have that much time, so it might be interesting for you. Okay. How are we? Do we have one moving around? Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. As I was saying over there, I think it's great also to make it as flowing as possible. I have questions, but if you do, it's a great opportunity to ask your questions to our panel. So, do we have a first question? Yes, we do. So let's start.
Bonjour, merci aux trois pour ces présentations. Moi, j'ai une question principalement pour Raoul. Déjà.
I'm a huge fan of Life is Strange, and thank you so much for Captain Spirit. We're really looking forward to Life is Strange 2. I have a question about your scenario. We see more and more this kind of narrative game that you can change the course of the story. It looks so complicated to write. How much time does it take you, on average, for this kind of project? For the time, it took about 3 years for Life is Strange, from the beginning to the release of the game. It's not really that long in the video game economy. It means long, but there are games that are longer, so 2 to 3 years on average. As I was saying earlier, that we will work with 2 directors and 1 writer. Jehanne could probably say a bit more about her somewhat different experience, but we work with a writer. We find a story we want to tell, and once we're happy with the story, we let the writer write all by himself, the way David writes his music all by himself. He needs to be alone for a long time, comes back to us with something that we like or don't like. Then there's quite a lot of back and forthing, maybe 2 months of that. And we're doing other things at the same time, pre-production and so on. But then we digest what the writer has produced, and we think about interactivity. What will the player have to do? How will we involve the player in the sequence and so on? And the style of game we make, it's simpler because it is quite linear. You have a central storyline to follow, and what matters to us is having coherent characters. So you can't leave complete freedom. The player can't do whatever they want with their character, so it is a bit more simple. I'd like to hear from Jehanne on it, because on an RPG it's much more open-ended, and I really admire. I couldn't do that kind of game, but it's so dense and yet it remains coherent. So it's more simple for us. It's more complicated than a film, because there are angles you have to think about that you don't have in a film. Nonetheless, you remain on a kind of a narrow narrative framework compared to other games. For us, we don't necessarily work the same way. You can't do everything. In a game, there are limits for the player, and they remain games that have a kind of powerful narration compared to a Sky game, for instance. You could get lost in the mountains for 45 minutes and not be worried about the story. We do kind of pull the player along with a kind of a storyline to reach a certain point at a certain time. It's at some point anyway. But we do have lots of branches on our tree. We create the universe first, because in an RPG you have not just one game, you have lots of side stories alongside the main stories, lots of side quests, companion quests that will contribute elements to the story, and it all has to be coherent, and to do that we have to create the universe. And then I'm working with the concept artists, but also with the game designers and the art director, and we're really used to working together. And when we've created a universe that we like, that's when I start. Then I end up in my personal cave and create the characters. And as I'm writing the background of the stories and imagining what might have happened to them before the game starts, that's when the various threads are going to start emerging. And I'm going to be able to write the main thread, but also all of the alternative lines, linked to the side quests and what you're able to do and so on. And then, of course, how you decide to resolve those quests. So I work on the universe, then the characters, and then only the storyline after that. And I think, like you have, we have the desire to tell certain stories, certain themes that we want to address, so things that are pretty have a commitment on certain levels, and so these have influences on our writing style. But there are things that take place successively. How much time do I spend creating a universe? Obviously, in pre-production, you have to compose as much as possible, but there are things that are going to keep adding well into the advanced stages of development when we realize that actually that village is going to need to have a story. It can't just appear like that. So then we're going to move it even further, and we'll have laid some bases that are detailed enough that will allow us to go faster in that creative process. Maybe the creation of a universe like Greedfall is, at least for the basics and the major lines, maybe 2 or 3 months, and knowing that afterwards it takes about 2 years to develop the game, so we'll continue adding things. We'll have created a language for that game, so we had to have a linguist who participated, and the process becomes much longer. So it can go quite quickly, but that's because we've got some experience now. And the best way to do it is to be kind of schizophrenic and have lots of characters talking in your head all the time, and then it's easy.
As a follow-up to all these very practical questions, I mean, of course, we have a panel of people with a lot of know-how and a long experience in the field of video game. I'm very interested in what you think is the best moment for a composer, the best time for a composer to join in a team, to start composing a music. Is it at the end, at the very beginning? What are you asking for?
For me, personally, I like to be involved from the very beginning because there are lots of design decisions that have to be made ideally with the rest of the team, with the animators, with the artists. And sometimes the music influences what the game is going to do as well. And a lot of what we do is timed, especially with the Nintendo stuff. And so you need to be involved, give them something, and then they'll start doing their animations to go in time with everything. We've got markers throughout the game that are giving cues to the game, and that's affecting the gameplay as well. So the music's very integrated within the game. And for me, if you're working at the beginning, that's great. If you're at the end, you're going to have to make decisions that aren't necessarily the best decisions, and you're going to need a lot of extra help, and you're not giving it the depth of thought that it
And did you have like example of your score actually influencing game design? Like suddenly you will have the game designer saying, "This is such a great score. Let's make it into a musical level," for example.
The last tune that you heard with all the vocals and stuff, it's all timed and it's all affecting what happens with the gameplay with those types of things. There's these big poles with horses' heads on, and they were being timed with the music. And so when you're jumping is critical. You have to listen to the music. I mean, you can do it without, but if you're listening to the music, it's giving you cues as when to jump, and that's affecting the gameplay. So all of it is very much integrated.
C'est un aspect pratique qui m'intéresse beaucoup avant qu'on
The practical aspect I'm really interested in. Maybe Raoul could answer here as well. There are elements that we don't really realize, the timing elements, things that have to do with money. When do you start doing the mock-up? When do you start recording voices? There are elements that are quite critical. We have really small budgets with regard to compared to the budgets Raoul could have had, or even the projects that David works on as well. We try to be clever. We reuse elements from like the combat mock-ups. We use things from one game to another. If the character is going to use a gun, well then that gun you can use it in various animations and so on. You create a kind of a bank of images that for games in a mock-up we cut it up into a number of sessions. The gameplay part, which happens really early in the game development, because we really need to make the characters move and interact with the universe and so on, and the cut scenes comes a lot later, when we've written a lot more about what we want to say, and when we've got enough dialogue so that the actors can really vocalize it, even if it's not their voices that we'll use, we still need to have them vocalize what's going to be said in the game. So there are several sessions. For the music, we work with Olivier, who is involved is often quite early, but he doesn't show us everything he does. He composes in his little corner, and then he shows us stuff from time to time. he comes to see how the story is evolving. He looks at the designs. He kind of drinks up a lot of things, even when there's a kind of a character in a completely empty space. But he wants to have he wants to understand the sensations we're trying to communicate, and then we get the final version almost at the end, when things are all completely integrated and really in the realization and the gameplay, and then he intervenes. He accesses really the code. Not really. The integration is usually done by our sound designer, who works internally with us, but they've known each other for 15 years and they're used to working together. It's a teamwork on that. For music, for us, it's a bit different, but it's really from the very start. I think we and the artists are happy to start working early. If you get to the end and you have to do everything, it's very frustrating. So we really integrate it early on. It's different from Olivier, who knows things, how things work in a real-time engine. But in Life is Strange, we had a musician who composed for the game, but who didn't really know the video game field. He plays a lot, but he didn't know how it works behind the scenes and how you make everything interactive. Or musicians like Wise, who make things, do incredible things. And, on the interactive level, what do you engage in sound and music, depending on what you do. So even with games that have sometimes the timing of combat, as David was saying, is really integral. So we've integrated most of these pieces of music, and Sébastien Gaillard, who's our audio director, integrated them, and then we talk about them, meet together, and we learn from each other. And it's really interesting to see his approach, which was not oriented toward interactivity, and so we had to ask him, as David was describing, when you compose for a game, what's different is you can cut it off at any time, you can move on to a different theme at any time, you need all of it's a composing style that's different from cinema. It might seem simple. I don't know if David is doing films, non-interactive films. It seems much more simple. But for us, this is different, and it's one of the aspects I really prefer in the game development, is mixing the music and the image with the image and creating an ensemble. I have a question for David, if I might be allowed. I can ask it in English also.
Do you know what do you prefer to have when you begin to work on a project? Is it like references, or you don't want any references to not be, I don't know, like or too much influenced or oriented, or you like to have, I don't know, like photos or videos or smells or ski travel, or
for me, for an influence, I like to see what the graphic guys are doing and what they're doing, and I prefer not to have musical references, if at all possible. I'd like to go and research and come up with my own. I often have strong ideas initially as soon as I see a product of what I think it should, of how I think it should sound. And I'd prefer to try and use those influences first of all. Sometimes people are so strong with what they want, they've heard something and they want something in the style of, and so you have to do your best interpretation of what they would like.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are credited on games on the NES, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
That's right.
And Beetlejuice.
Yes.
And we are at a fantastic film festival, and these are, of course, fantastic films. So do you have any, of course, you have already the original musical score that is composed, you have visuals from the movie, or?
Yeah, with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I worked on 2 games, and Alan Silvestri had sent me the scores, and he'd sent me a lot of the stuff that didn't even go into the actual film that I could listen to and take as a reference, and then I needed to interpret it down to 4 notes. And so it lost a lot in translation, to be honest, but it was nice it was a great learning tool for me to be able to listen to somebody, because I was like, I just started and I've got this score from Alan Silvestri, he did Back to the Future, one of my all-time favourite films, and you've got all of these stems and all of this music that that the orchestra have got, it was a huge learning tool and very inspirational. Yeah. Sadly, it got down to 4 notes, and I completely trashed it and ruined it. But I did the best that I could with the technology that we had.
So David, do you still compose for? Do you compose for not video game or?
Most of my work now is video game. In days gone past, I did stuff for Sky Sports and a few little mini trailer type films and that kind of stuff. Most of the film type stuff that I do is actually the music that's used for in game, you know, for the trailers and for the story type part of it.
We have questions in the audience. Hello. From another David.
Je peux faire en français, ça?
Oui.
Ok. D'abord, merci pour vos présentations. C'était très intéressant. Ma question, c'est sur... Jehanne a fait une remarque intéressante. Elle disait que
really interesting remark about when you imagine a new world, a new universe, you have to justify lots of things, political systems, economic systems, beliefs of the characters, and so on. And they had this comment that it's something that you do less in film, perhaps. Of course, you do it in the film, but you really understand that in an open world, in a game, the environment has to respond to the players' questions about that world. So there are lots of things you have to really prepare for those answers. But my question is, at what point do you stop? When, as a team, do you say, okay, look, this is enough? Nobody cares. The people will understand. Because you're tempted, I imagine, that you just keep going further and further. And so there are answers that you need, and then there are other answers that are more about narration, kind of side narration, things that enrich the universe. And so at what point do you say, enough is enough? Never. We don't use everything in the game, but it's important with regard to creating a universe to have an answer to everything, potentially, including things you won't see in the game, because it'll be useful for a future game or another story in that same universe, but above all because the fact of having those answers, if at any given time a game designer comes and sees we sort of have to add a character here for this reason or that reason, what's their name going to be, and they wait for our answer, and then we have to supply these answers, and then you have answers that come spontaneously, quite naturally, and it's therefore easy to add tiny details into that universe, and for have those details to be coherent, because you have the universe in mind. You don't write it all down, of course, but we don't necessarily, the conceptors don't concretize every element, but we have it in mind, and we're always thinking about all the questions that the team might come up with. Sometimes, yes, when we work with Olivier, I don't want to influence him by saying, I'd like it to sound like such and such a movie or anything like that. That's not useful at all, because when you're using a talented musician like Olivier, it's ridiculous to try to teach him how to do his job, but he needs and he likes to learn as much as possible about the universe. And so, obviously, sometimes he calls me and said, in this village, what happens there? What's going on around it? What's the visual environment going to be like? I don't know. Are they herders? You know, and you have to be able to answer him immediately. And it helps him to compose. So it's really in the service of the entire team, whether it's the level designers, the graphic designers, the people who are going to be doing the costumes and environments, and obviously for the whole artistic direction, having those answers, even in the end, if they're not explicit in the game. I'm not really someone who likes to have a sign above everything saying this village is called blah 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 and it was founded in this date. Who cares? That's not what the player wants to know. It's more about discovering the history of the game through the contact with the characters they'll encounter, and it's possible when you've gone really far in creating the universe.
Tout à fait.
Exactly. I don't think it's any lost time when you go through that process. There's a danger, though, which is to do too much. I know that personally, I've never done it, but I've seen other developers who really love it. It's really great creating a universe. It's fun, and maybe you might want to only do that, and then there's no game in the end, actually. So you have to be careful to tell yourself, look, okay, good, I've got enough elements. It's not useless for the project to do more rather than less. But in a film, of course, you do it, but there's a given story that's anchored and rooted, and what happens around it. You know, you'll encounter a character in a vessel. We'll know who they come from and they'll have a background in general. The director will plan on that, of course, but in a video game, it's exponential. You're going to be in that village. Okay, well, then there's a herd. Then it's a herd of what? And then why do they have it? And how do they survive? Do they grow crops? What kind of crops? And so it's really important to know that and to have it be accessible to the player. But when everything's created from scratch, but for the games that we've done, for instance, we do have a context that limits us. We create a city which is realistic. And so the sounds, you can you know what those are going to be. When everything's a fantasy or sci-fi, then there's a lot more creation and coherent elements that need to be imagined. For us in a video game, we start development even if we don't have we haven't imagined everything. Is the budget limits us, you know, because we don't have money yet because we have to start developing so that we can get some budget. After 3 years, we've got a Bible that's pretty good, and the publisher will be like, no, we're actually not publishing a book here. There was a question in the back of the theater. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. I had a question about the productions that come from Quantic Dreams or Don't Nod, which are now kind of video play. There's not that much play for a video game. Are they thought out as being a kind of for a gaming public or more audience, or more of a film audience actually? I'm thinking, having played these games, it borrows a lot more from film than from video games, those specific games. So in the end, are they really thought of being a kind of a bridge from film goers to move into video gaming, or? I'm not going to answer for Quantic Dreams. When people talk about that there's not that much gameplay, I say it's a kind of gameplay. There are other kinds of gameplay. I'm really pleased that there are really big gamers who play, you know, hardcore gamers who play it to Life is Strange and who like it. I think you can play at anything. I don't say who I'm doing it for, someone who's more of a film lover, or people who come from games or something. It's really more about the stories I want to tell and the themes I want to address. And, you know, I think this kind of low gameplay element, the works that we're trying to create, keep a very important aspect, which is interactivity. And there can be several levels of the interactivity: completely open, you know, you'd be completely in your character. Those are the stories I know how to tell, but with certain limits, and by keeping this interactive side, you can lead to quite powerful scenes, actually. And I'm convinced that a scene, even if there are not a lot of choices in that scene itself, but if it's the player, through their actions, has brought the story to that place, and through their actions has launched this sequence instead of another, that sequence will be all the more powerful, and I'm convinced of that. And I think that's why forgive things of video games, because they're interactive and the dialogue, or maybe something that wouldn't be quite so strong. It's powerful because the player got there themselves. That's what I like about video games. I think it's really the most powerful medium, actually, because each teach a completely different generation. Our target, when I made Life is Strange, I'm going to touch a larger audience, and I'm going to talk to a generation, and the game it remains interactive. There are a whole bunch of reasons, actually. So maybe there's not an enormous amount of gameplay. It's not a skilled gameplay. I know for the first time my father played a game because he played Life is Strange, and he can do it. He doesn't throw the handheld controls. He doesn't throw them away because he's just frustrated. I know I can get people to play who understand what interactivity is. You're looking around yourself. He's not going to do an RPG, I'm sure, but it's okay. I don't mind for your dad. There's something for everyone. We have another question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all to be here today. My question is for David about basically your presentation. You showcased the evolution of game music from the Yamaha, from those chips in those 16-bit consoles to now. Would you be interested to be back to compose to that kind of chips, either through emulation to try to recreate it with today's instruments and today's tools, or to go back to those old tools like the Yamaha or others, because we see an interest basically for chiptune, for or graphics, for that kind of style of game. And I wondered if you, who saw for your career that whole evolution, if you are interested by that.
I think it's an interesting idea to actually go back and recreate some of the sounds and use the tools from yesteryear, but I think having contemplated, I'd rather shoot myself. So. It was torturous. It really was. It was interesting at the time. It was a brand new world, and it was a new career. But to go back, and the amount of work, the amount of focus and concentration to get something to sound like a doorbell is phenomenal. Whereas now you've got all of these tools, and quite quickly you can get something to sound nice, and you can go with it, and then you can do something else with it, and you can go off. But to actually get something to sound as bad as it does on the NES requires a huge amount of effort and work, and to listen to it over and over, it's like torture, honestly. I think some of the sounds I do use some of the old Super NES or Super Nintendo sounds, and that's quite interesting because you can use the MIDI and you can use them with modern effects, and you can make them sound quite different. But to actually go back and to have that as a tool set to use, I'm not sure why anybody would want to choose to do that unless they've got mental problems that need resolving. You're welcome.
We have one more question, and it might be the last one, I guess. Do we have time for more? Okay, so we have at least 2 more questions. And Raoul, you have one more? Okay.
Quand on débute dans un projet pour un jeu vidéo, on est toujours totalement excité, fou, et ce genre de choses.
Excited and crazy and everything. How do you manage your motivation and keep it stable throughout the project, not lose motivation after 3 months of coding, and there's still the same kind of graphics? 3 months is nothing.
C'est une très bonne question.
That's a good question.
On se la pose tous les jours.
We wonder the same thing every day ourselves.
Ouais, c'est pour ça que tout à l'heure je parlais de thèmes.
That's why I talked about themes and things that matter.
Je pense qu'en effet, c'est pas que se motiver.
It's not just motivating yourself, but it's also motivating a group of people who are making the game. And you couldn't make a game without a team, and motivating them every day. They see these crazy ideas. They don't agree with everything we want to do, and of course you lose faith if it lasts. Takes a year or 2 years, 3 years. I was talking to somebody recently about this moment when a scene starts to work, or a character or gameplay starts to work really, and you see the light at the end of the tunnel, and people are like, yeah, we can do a cool thing there, actually. and you have to believe it. Sometimes you have to lie to yourself, but I think you have. It's not based on much. You know, you have this guiding light. You know, are you making this game to have fun? Is it to talk about a theme or to tell a story? Is to show really interesting visuals? I mean, there are lots of good reasons, and none of them are better than any others. It helps, you know, if you're earning a living, that helps too. But then afterwards, it's more about the attitude with the team that's really important. There will always be people who disagree with you. That's you have people together, working together for years, and start. You know, if you've got faith, you know, you do. It helps the whole team. But I don't have a magic formula. You have to remember why you started. I think there are days when you really don't want to get up and you don't want to get down to work, and it's what you're saying, that it's a team work, and sometimes it's the other people who are going to come and say, no, really, look at what I've done, this is great. And Camille, for instance, who directs for us, and or someone who shows us artwork, and then it gives you a kind of a boost. You see new stuff, really helps you.
Ils le font pas forcément en conscience. Enfin, je crois pas.
They don't do it intentionally. You know, it's just a team dynamic when things function well. And it's the same. Or they launch a scene, a game scene that, you know, your programmers will go and see the graphics. And so it's a team dynamic. And the person who's feeling kind of down, they have to go have a look at what the other people are doing and motivate each other. And it generates a well-functioning dynamic. But we haven't developed anything for longer than 2.5 years, and I don't know if we'd be capable of going beyond that. You know, in the end, that we all want to hang ourselves, and we just we have to renew our team because half of them are dead already. I mean, I think it might be a bit much. 2.5 years, honestly, I think that's like a limit. It's really quite long, you know, because then of course you have to test it. Before you release it, you know, you've tested every single aspect of it. You've seen absolutely all the horrible bugs, but you keep remembering all those bugs. You see every flaw. Actually, all you can see anymore are the flaws. It's painful toward the end. But the love of the project comes back after, you know, when you've got a bit of distance, you've got some perspective, you've moved on to something. You know, at the end of Technomancer, people came and see me. It's like, now, come on, we've got done with Mars. You know, we're sick of it. I don't care what we want. Something with greenery, with trees, and then we did Greedfall.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, 3 months is you know, tiny. Going back to the mental health thing, we're very lucky in the industry that we work in that we can get up in the morning and we've got a purpose. And being creative, there's nothing better for mental health than being creative and having something to show for it. And then when you work in a team of people, you know, there might be 20 or 30 people, and everybody's kind of like you. They might be working on graphics, they might be working on design, but they've got this common purpose and this common goal, and we're all bringing this creative process. So, I mean, I've worked on games that have lasted 5 years, but we've got to the end of it because we knew where we were going with it. So it's not like a chore. It's, you know, it's great. Jump out of bed in the morning. This is what we're doing today. Let's go forward with it. But I mean, 5 years is a bit long. But certainly 3 years, I wouldn't see a problem with a whole creative team putting 3 years of working, whether it's in films, you know, something like Pixar. They spend a lot of time doing it. But because they're working together as a team, it makes the job a whole lot more fun than if you did it on your own.
And one here and one over there. Who has the mic?
Bonjour. Alors déjà, merci à vous, parce que c'est grâce à des gens comme vous que je peux vivre ma passion
that I can live for my passion, which is video games. There's so much creation behind it, the artists, music, like David Wise, or the music's in Donkey Kong, I know it by heart. Life is Strange, really beautiful. Thank you so much. There's And my question is quite simple. Is video gaming an art? Is the video game a work of art? Simply, you have 2 hours to answer that question. I want to say by saying that there are lots of arts actually together. That's obvious. And yes, it's an art, of course. But we don't care. Really, we don't care. Honestly, we couldn't care less. It doesn't change anything. Aside from the fact that maybe there'll be a money from the Ministry of Culture or a book or something, but it shouldn't change anything. It shouldn't change the way we address the media as a maker or a lover of the, as an amateur in the noble sense of the term. Is it an art? Is it not an art? They drank out of jars, or out of cups with stuff painted on it. They didn't say this is a work of art. They're like, this is what I eat off of. So, on a practical level, NIFFF has invited these panelists as artists. Thank you, David.
You see, I think it's actually better than art because it's creative art, isn't it? It's like collective art. It's better than the individual parts, isn't it? Definitely more than art, but art nonetheless.
Merci.
Bonjour. Oui, merci beaucoup pour vos présentations. I have a question for David. I can go on and on about Donkey Kong Country, his music, and what it means to me. I think the very first piece that caught my attention was the underwater level. I was feeling like that the level is designed around the music and not the other way around. So yeah, thank you for your enough fanboy raving. So, what is like to work on a franchise after 15 years? What has changed in the Donkey Kong franchise from Donkey Kong Country to Tropical Freeze?
Well, loads of things technically have changed in the fact that the graphics are better, the designs are better, the tools that I've got to create the music with have advanced so much, and so it's like retelling it for our time. It's like being given a whole big fun box of toys to use to create something. As for the water music or the aquatic ambience, that was actually it came after I'd seen the graphics for it. They'd basically got it in, and it was done over Christmas. At the time, I was in quite a dark place, and it was sort of part of a healing type thing. So. Creating it, I'd got totally involved in it. It took me 5 weeks to actually get that out, but it didn't matter because we'd had the Christmas break, so I just worked all the way through Christmas and came back with this piece of music. And another thing I was trying was lots of technical things because the Super NES was actually quite restricted. I mean, it got 64K of memory, which is infinitesimally small, but by comparison these days, we've got terabytes on SSD drives and it's lightningly fast, but 64K on a little chip, it's tiny. And I got a synth called the Korg Wave Station. It got these tiny little single cycle waveforms, and you could resynthesize them. So if you could take a big sound and take it into a tiny little sound and put them all back together again, it started to sound quite interesting. And I was really into that kind of nerdish, super nerdish kind of technical thing. Oh, we can do this now, and nobody's done it before. And because I'm programming it and not using MIDI, I can set up all these subroutines, and it can go through. It can scan through all these waveforms and play them back in a different order. And it suddenly sounded so much better than I could have done before. And that was the driver behind that. And so I sort of took it to them and said, look, I've come up with this piece of music, and it's using this. And fortunately, everybody over in Japan loved it, and I've built my career on it. So. I'm not complaining, but yes, it was a technical thing and very much a voyage of discovery at that time, for me anyway. So it seemed to work out anyway.
Thank you. We have the event organizer with the question, so let's take it extra seriously.
Yes. Still a question for David is, are you afraid they come to you for the next 60 years saying, hey, we have Donkey Kong 74, 75, 76. You will never run out of ideas. You will always be inspired by this franchise, or how is it? What's your...
Yeah, I'd be delighted if in 70 years' time they were coming, Dave, dragging me out of the grave. We've got another tune for you to write. But yeah, I just love doing that kind of stuff. So I'd jump at the chance, obviously. But for now, I've got lots of other... I'm working on another game that involves another animal at the moment that's furry, but in a different setting, not like Donkey Kong. So yeah, as long as people keep coming up with these requests, I'm quite happy to oblige, and I don't get bored doing it. And there's so many new technologies coming out all the time, and it never gets boring. Well, at least it doesn't for me, but maybe I'm easily pleased. So, but I still enjoy it. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just finish on just one final question for the whole panel. We have film festival, we have music festival, we have video games music festival, as you were telling me. And right now, at the moment, we are in what was first a film festival that is opening itself. It's been opening itself for a while now to video games, and how there is links and discussion being made in both these medias. What do you think is the one thing or two things that are interesting in this sort of merging, or what do you think is possible from now on, of sort of bringing video games in film festival, or even having people starting to think of how to showcase a video game in a festival, and all these discussions? Because I think we still are at the beginning of making the best out of a festival, of an event around video games.
J'en ai parlé toute la soirée.
Maybe one thing.
Donc je vais peut-être vous laisser.
Raoul.
Si je dis tout le contraire de ce que tu as dit au NIFFF de faire l'année prochaine, on est mal.
What I said for NIFFF for next year.
Non, c'est vrai que c'est quelque chose.
It is something I think about often. I worked a few years ago on documentary film festivals, theater, circus. I've seen how it's done in other media. I think there's a lot to be done for video gaming. But in the media of the video game, medium of the video game, it's so varied. You have a game jam like we had this weekend was a festival in and of itself. You know, developers who are talking about their art, show it. What's cool with a game is that it's living and interactive, and the game jam corresponds to that. I don't know what the perfect format would be for a video game. I'm really happy to be in contact with film people because of the kind of game I make, and there are a lot of artists who come from one world and move into the other. When we saw what they did on Avengers or Yester Weta, it was really, you know, it's amazing. How do you tell a story? One of them is interactive, the other's not, but it's the same techniques and same artists. I've worked with artists who come from film, composers, riggers. It's all mixed together now. I think the perfect event to bring that all together, I don't know what it would be, but I think that NIFFF's doing pretty well.
Okay, for me, when I watch a film, the thing that I like from a film is getting something emotionally from it. Whether it's about injustice or whether it's a love thing or whatever. So when you see a film, you've got these great composers like James Newton Howard and Hans Zimmer and many, many others. They manage to really dig out that emotion, and you get to the end of the film, and a good film, you feel almost emotionally exhausted, but you've got something out of it. And I think for video games, it would be really nice to dig into that, and to bring that out more. There are a few games that manage to do it, but I think, for me, if video games could certainly do more of that, to really pull the things that really get your heartstrings, or you know, the things that you react to, and if they could do that, I think players will get even more out of games than they already do, and that for me would be the way forward for video games.
On en a un peu parlé du coup effectivement hier. Moi, il y a plusieurs festivals déjà qui existent de jeux vidéo que je trouve intéressants, comme le Stunfest par exemple à Rennes, qui est un événement très intéressant, assez punk,
really interesting, very punk.
Des indés qui présentent
they're indies who present their projects.
Des indés, c'est vraiment pour le coup des micro studios avec.
I think these are like micro studios, 2 or 3 people who are developing their games, working, doing other things. There's a game jam also. There's an e-sport part. It mixes lots of things, and there's a conference section that takes place in parallel, a purely professional side, and then a general public side that addresses really lots of different themes. There's another festival that's not purely video game, but that I like is the Utopias in Nantes, and so they bring lots of different media together. It was created by booksellers, so it's really literary originally, but then it brought in film, and then video game was added, and then board games as well. So in addition to the fact that there are exhibitions, games that you can play on, that are for free for play, there's of course a large bookshop. There are book signings and signings of other kind of works, but they also organize kind of intermedia roundtables that are really interesting. It might be interesting to have somebody comes from pure film and who could give us their point of view based on, about what we do, and then to have these kind of cross discussions that can be really interesting and enriching. And I would say, like Raoul, the pure, preaching to the choir meeting, I'm not so interested in. I really like to hear from people who come from very different horizons, from backgrounds, fields, professions that are very different, and they can exchange points of view on really fundamental questions. And that's when the really interesting stuff happens sometimes. So thank you so much to all of you for being here, and applause for everyone. Thank you, Raoul.
Merci David.
David.
Et merci Jehanne.
And Jehanne.
Merci Sam. Et merci
thank you, Sam,
for
organizing all of this. And thank you, David Javet, who moderated this roundtable for us. This concludes our 14th ITF, Imaging the Future during this 18th NIFFF. We hope we'll be here all week, and I really want to thank once again our fantastic sponsors, BCN, Le Matin, RTS, SRG, SSR, as well as, more specifically for ITF, the CESM, HEARC, and the Art of VFX. And I really like to thank you so much for being present, and I really wish you a wonderful end of the festival, and see you next year.